Hello students, how are you all? This is Anup sir, your English teacher. Students, in this video, we are going to understand our last lesson, that is the Great Stone Face Part 2. And before we begin with the lesson, let me give you a small introduction about this lesson. Students, the Great Stone Face 2 is an extension of the lesson number 9, that is the Great Stone Face 1. Ernest, a very simple and unnoticed boy, had grown up to be an old man with white hair. All the years that brought him here were not useless because he had become so wise that the number of wise thoughts exceeded the number of white hairs on his head. He was not unpopular anymore. Many people came to see him, and the story tells us about one such poet born in the valley who had moved to distant cities but had come back to meet Ernest. In the end of this story, the old prophecy gets fulfilled as they find the man who bore likeness of the great stone face. The years hurried on and brought white hairs upon the head of Ernest, and made wrinkles across his forehead and furrows in his cheeks. He was an old man, but not in vain had he grown old. More numerous than his white hairs on his head were the wise thoughts in his mind. And Ernest had ceased to be obscure. Unsought for, undesired, had come the fame which so many seek. He had become famous beyond the limits of the valley. College professors and even the active men of cities came from far to see and converse with Ernest, and he received them with gentle sincerity and spoke freely with them of whatever came uppermost or lay deepest in his heart or their own. While they talked together, his face would brighten, unawares, and shine upon them as with a mild evening light. So, students, many years passed, and Ernest was now an old man with white hairs upon his head, wrinkles across his forehead, and deep lines on his cheeks. All the years that brought him to this stage were not useless because he had become so wise that the number of wise thoughts exceeded the number of white hairs on his head. He was popular now, although he did not wanted this popularity. He received this fame which many people want. In fact, he had become popular outside the valley too. Many active men from the cities, college professors, and people far away used to come to see him and have a conversation with Ernest. He welcomed them with great sincerity and conversed with them with his purest heart, saying whatever came to his mind or even sharing his deepest thoughts. As he talked to the people, his face would brighten, that would shine upon others as if he was a mild evening light, with him being unaware of it. While Ernest had been growing old, God had granted a new poet to this earth. He too was a native of the valley, but had spent the greater part of his life in distant cities, pouring out his sweet music everywhere. Neither was the great stone face forgotten, for the poet had celebrated it in a poem. The songs of his poet found their way to Ernest. He read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. So, students, as Ernest grew old with each year that passed by, he came to know about the poet who had come to this earth by the grace of God. Although the poet was a native of the valley, He had spent most of his life in the distant cities, blessing them with his musical poem. He even kept the great stone face alive with his poem. His work made its way to Ernest, and after winding up his usual day's work, Ernest would read while sitting on the bench in front of his cottage door. After reading the poems, Ernest would lift his eyes to glance at the face of the great stone. O great stone face, he said, is not this man worthy to be your likeness? The face seemed to smile, but did not answer. Now it happened that the poet, though he lived so far away, had not only heard of Ernest, but had thought much about his character, and wished to meet this man whose wisdom walked hand in hand with the noble simplicity of his life. One summer day, therefore, he arrived at the Ernest's door, where he found the good old man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and then, with a finger between the leaves, looked lovingly at the great stone face. So, students, as Ernest read the poet's works, he lifted his eyes so as to see the great stone face and asked him if the poet was worthy of possessing the likeness of the great stone face. The mountain appeared as if it was smiling, but it did not reply. On the other hand, although the poet lived far away from the valley, he very well knew about Ernest and put so much thoughts into his character that he wanted to meet Ernest, who was so wise yet simple in his way of living. Now, one summer day, this poet reached at Ernest's cottage and found Ernest reading a book, and after a while, Ernest put his finger between the pages he was reading and looked at the great stone face lovingly. Good evening, said the poet. Can you give a traveler a night's shelter? Gladly, answered Ernest. And then he added smilingly, I think I never saw the great stone face look so hospitably at a stranger. The poet sat down beside him, and he and Ernest talked together. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. So, students, the poet greeted Ernest by saying good evening and asked him to let him stay there for a night. Ernest agreed gladly, as the poet further said with a smile on his face that he had never seen the great stone face welcome a stranger so gently and kindly. The poet sat beside Ernest, and they conversed for a while. The poet had never had the chance of talking to a wise, gentle, and a kind man like Ernest, while, on the other hand, Ernest was amazed at listening to the poet speaking so vividly. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen to. He gazed into the poet's eyes. Who are you, my gifted guest? He asked. The poet laid his finger on the book that Ernest had been reading. You have read these poems, said he. You know me, then, for I wrote them. So, students, while Ernest listened to what the poet was saying, he visualized the great stone face bending to listen to him too. As he looked into the poet's eyes, Ernest very politely asked who he was. The poet pointed at the book in Ernest's hand and told Ernest that if he had read this book, he would know him, as he himself had written this book. Again and again, Ernest examined the poet's features. He turned towards the great stone face then back. He shook his head and sighed. Why are you sad? Inquired the poet. Because, replied Ernest, all through life I have awaited the fulfillment of a prophecy. And when I read these poems, I hoped that it might be fulfilled in you. You hoped, answered the poet, faintly smiling, to find in me the likeness of the great stone face. I am not worthy to be its likeness. So, students, as soon as Ernest knew who the man was, he began noticing his features as he turned repeatedly towards the great stone face. Being disappointed, Ernest heaved a sigh. Upon being asked by the poet the reason behind his sadness, Ernest told him how he had waited all his life for the prophecy to come true, and how he hoped the poet would fulfill it when he read his poems. Bringing a faint smile upon his face, the poet replied that he is not worthy of being the resemblance of the great stone face. And why not? Asked Ernest. He pointed to the book. Are not those thoughts worthy? You can hear in them the distant voice of a heavenly song. But my life, dear Ernest, has not corresponded with my thoughts. I have had grand dreams, but they have been only dreams. Sometimes I lack faith in my own thoughts. Why then, pure seeker of the good and true, should you hope to find me in the face of the mountain? The poet spoke sadly, and his eyes were wet with tears. So, too, were those of Ernest. So, students, Ernest asked the poet why he didn't consider himself and his thoughts to be worthy of it. The poet replied that he was aware that his thoughts recite a distant voice of a heavenly song, but his life had no match with his thoughts. The poet told Ernest that he had seen huge dreams, but they have remained only dreams, as he had often lacked faith in his own thoughts. The poet further asked why a man like Ernest, who was so good and true, would see the resemblance of the great stone face in the poet. The poet said all of it in a sad tone, and his eyes were filled with tears. Ernest's eyes had tears in them too. At the hour of sunset, as had been his custom, Ernest was to speak to a group of neighbors in the open air. Together, he and the poet went to the meeting place, arm in arm. From there could he see the great stone face. Students, now Ernest had a habit of speaking to his neighbors at the hour of sunset in open air. Therefore, he and his guest went to the meeting place arm in arm. The great stone face was also visible from the meeting place. Ernest threw a look of familiar kindness around upon his audience. He began to speak to the people what was in his heart and mind. His words had power because they agreed with his thoughts, and his thoughts had reality and depth because they harmonized with the life which he had always lived. It was not mere breath that the preacher uttered. They were the words of life. A life of good deeds and selfless love was melted into them. The poet, as he listened, felt that the life and character of Ernest were a noble strain of poetry than he had ever written. His eyes filled with tears, and he said to himself that never was there so worthy a sage as that mild, sweet, thoughtful face, with the glory of white hair diffused about it. So, students, as He began speaking to his audience. Ernest radiated familiar kindness upon them. He spoke whatever came in his heart and mind. His words had a unique power because they corresponded with his thoughts, and his thoughts were deep and practical because they corresponded how he had always lived his life. He did not just preach, but shared words of life, words that were filled with love and supported by a life spent on good deeds. As the poet heard Ernest speak, he thought to himself that the life story and personality of Ernest was in itself a form of poetry, something he had never written. His eyes became wet with tears as he heard Ernest and his thoughts to himself how he had never crossed path with a man so wise, kind, and gentle, with a thoughtful face that had the glory of white hair spread around it. At a distance, but clearly to be seen, high up in the golden light of the setting sun, appeared the great stone face with white mists around it, like the white hairs around the brows of Ernest. At that moment, Ernest's face took on an expression so grand that the poet was moved to throw his arms up and shout, "Behold, behold, Ernest is himself the likeness of the great stone face." So, students, although a few miles away, the great stone face was clearly visible from their meeting point. The golden light of the sundown fell upon it, along with mist that covered it, just like the white hair around Ernest's brows. At that particular moment, Ernest's grand expression was such that when the poet compared it with the great stone face, he could not control himself, as he threw his arms in the air and shouted, "Behold, behold," to draw everyone's attention to the face that Ernest is the likeness of the great stone face. Then all the people looked and saw that what the poet said was true. The prophecy was fulfilled. But Ernest, having finished what he had to say, took the poet's arm and walked slowly homeward, still hoping that some wiser and better man than himself would by and by appear, bearing a resemblance to the great stone face. So, students, the people there started comparing Ernest with the great stone face and finally thought that the poet was telling the truth. Finally, the prophecy was fulfilled. Ernest, however, finished his speech and held the poet's arm, and they walked slowly towards the home. Ernest still hoped that a man wiser and better than him would someday come, who will be the likeness of the great stone face. So, students, this is all about this lesson. We have completed all our literature lessons till this video. I will send you the notes in the next lecture. Till then, this is Anup sir saying thank you and goodbye.